Yeah, so I'm going to talk about some slightly different stuff to Elaine. Basically, how to manage frog habitat if you've got some frog habitat on your place, and potentially how to create some frog habitat if you want to attract some frogs to your backyard or your farm. So let's go to the next slide. So yeah, the talk's broken down to sort of three components. The first bit's what do frogs need, what are the basic frog habitat requirements, how do you manage a natural wetland for frogs, frog conservation, and also the third bit, how would you go about creating some frog habitat. So basic needs for frogs are a clean source of water, and Elaine spoke about how most frogs need free water because they lay eggs and then have a free-living tadpole stage, a larval stage. And there are some exceptions to that, like there's a sphagnum frog, which the tadpole stage is actually in sphagnum, like moist sphagnum moss, so it doesn't actually need open water. And there are some frogs which go through the metamorphosis in their little jelly sac, in a little like egg. So yeah, they don't actually have a free swimming tadpole. But that's only a few exceptions. Most frogs have a tadpole stage, so they need water to live in, and it needs to be pretty clean because, as someone's already mentioned, frogs are like the canary in the coal mine environmentally. They're very susceptible to environmental pollution, some more than others. But one of the reasons for that is that they have a permeable skin. So and their skin's actually an organ they breathe through and they can absorb moisture through, and obviously tadpoles have gills for taking oxygen from the water. So they're exposed to the environment. They're living in wetlands. They're living in rivers and where all the water and contamination flows down to. So if you're having herbicide runoff or pesticide runoff going into a wetland, so they're down in the sort of sump or the bottom of the catchments, and so if you've got a contaminated environment, it's going to affect frogs. So having healthy frog populations and healthy frog diversity is a good indication that the environment's healthy and not too polluted. So yeah, so they need clean water, number one. Like everything else, they need food to survive. So and that could be in most cases probably invertebrates. In some cases, like growling grass frogs, they eat other frogs, so they need a healthy food source population. So things like this little mayfly here, and they need to shelter from predators of things like herons and egrets and other things, snakes that'll want to come and eat them. So a good frog habitat will have a good range will have clean water, but it'll have all these other sort of micro-habitat components for sheltering and feeding and breeding. So it'll have things like tussocky sedges and rushes around the edge of the wetland, logs or rocks and other things for adult frogs to hide under when they're not out breeding and mating or finding food. So they need lots of diverse little micro-habitats. So for types of frog habitats, if you look all around the world, frogs occur from anywhere from deserts to mountain regions to rainforest and everything in between. So yeah, there's frogs adapted to all sorts of different environments. As Elaine said, there's about 5,800 species in the world. But around here, the main types of frog habitats are. Can people hear me when I turn? Is that okay? Yep. So we've got perennial streams and rivers. And that's mainly tree frogs, things like the rocky river frog Elaine mentioned before. The brown tree frogs are often in riparian areas. Then you've got little seasonal drainage lines. Like these are tiny little creeks, or just even the seepage areas where the water soaks through the forest. And in box ironbark forest, in the summertime, you wouldn't even know some of these are there. They're just dried up little soaks. And you might only be able to tell because there might be the odd red gum or and some other plants that indicate that there's a bit of water seeping through in winter. And these little seepage lines are the important habitat for things like the Bibrin's toadlet or brood frog. It's called a brood frog because, as Elaine mentioned, it broods its eggs. Out on the plains areas, you've got different types of wetlands, often classified as to how deep they are, how long they hold water for. So, for example, you've got shallow freshwater marshes. These are areas or freshwater meadows. They're places where the water they're usually low down in the landscape, usually on sort of heavy clayey soils, and they might be flooded for say 3 months of the year. So over winter rains, they might the ground starts to the clays in the soil start to swell up and start to form an impermeable layer, and then the rain will start to pond on the surface, And so by about August, they might start to, July, August, they'll fill up with water. And then, because they're only very shallow, usually these shallow freshwater marshes might only be 20 or 30 centimetres deep. Usually by November or December, we start getting some hot north winds. It starts to get over 30 degrees. And the evaporation rate, you might lose a centimetre of water a day. And so after a couple of weeks, those wetlands will dry out. So they're only fairly short-lived wetlands. Only, as I say, they might hold water for 3 or 4 months of the year. And so only small little frogs, like the little froglets, or this is a little Sloane's froglet here, only small frogs with a really rapid turnover from the time they lay their eggs to the time they metamorphose and can survive the wetland drying out, can survive in those sort of shallow type environments, or shallow type wetlands. Whereas the deep freshwater marshes, like things like the growling grass frog, because it takes a lot longer, at least 6 months and up to 15 months for the egg to develop into a little metamorphed frog that can then crawl away and get out of it can survive out of the water. So they need much deeper, more sort of not permanent but sort of semi-permanent wetlands, or wetlands that are there for maybe 6 or 9 months of the year. And even within a wetland, frogs sort of divide up the habitats or divide up a wetland depending on where they like to be. So this is a sort of a schematic cross-section of a wetland. It's got some sort of shallower bits, some just marshy bits, and then going down into some deeper water with reeds at the edge. So things like your parent's tree frog would be either sitting up in the shrubby vegetation or in the reeds, and they'll be calling from up in there. And they'll move, obviously once they find a mate, they'll move down into the water to actually mate. The little common froglet, usually just on the damp verges of a water body or a wetland, not usually sort of out in the deeper water. But then the growling grass frogs, they're much more of an aquatic frog. That's what my daughter calls a polywog, which is not quite a frog and it's not quite a tadpole. You can see it's a tadpole, it's grown all these legs. Can crawl out onto vegetation but still got a big tail and still needs a bit of time to reabsorb that tail and turn into a true little frog. But they'll be out in the deeper water amongst submerged vegetation. And then things like the spadefoot toad or the painted burrowing frog will be in the sort of the shallows as well. So yeah, using different habitats within a wetland. So important habitat component for frogs in wetlands is vegetation. So if you want to manage habitat or recreate it, managing the vegetation is really important. And wetland plants come in a range of different types of landforms and shapes and sizes. And all of these are having a diversity of habitat types. It means you're going to have lots of different microhabitats and little niches for frogs to live in. So, some of the types of plants are things like submerged vegetation, things that grow completely under the water, things like eel grasses and pondweeds. Then you've got your floating non-attached type species like lemna and duckweed and azolla. And they can be good habitat just because they provide a bit of cover. So, frogs can duck under there and avoid predators like herons and egrets and things. The submerged vegetation, often growling grass frogs, will be just sort of floating in amongst rafts of submerged vegetation. And again, as soon as a predator comes along or they detect a predator, they can just duck under and they've got some cover to hide in amongst. You're probably all aware of, there's a classic sort of frog sitting on a water lily, sort of image a lot of people have. We have some things that are like water lilies, things like marsh flowers and water nymph type species. And again, they're great habitat because it's like having a little shield they can sort of slip in and hide under if a predator comes along. Emergent things like sedges and rushes, again, are fantastic habitat. Lots of little nooks and crannies to hide in, get away from snakes and birds and things. Mudflat colonist type species, things that as the water level recedes, quite often little herbs come up. And again, they often come up in quite dense cover and a good habitat for frogs around the edges of water bodies. And then you've got the big woody things like big river red gums and shrubs. And again, they're important for creating habitat. As the branches and the bark falls off, again, that creates little micro habitats as well. And things like parents' tree frogs will often hide in hollow logs and things. And actually, like Elaine was saying, the bigger the louder the call, the more attractive it is to the female. And so quite often you'll hear parents' tree frogs calling from within a tree hollow, and it sort of sounds, it's like amplified, it's like they've got stereo happening. Curtain rails in the wrong spot there, but basically that's just showing that you've got brine swamp in the Grampians during a dry phase, and when it's wet, And wetting and drying of wetlands is actually really important ecologically. And so wetlands that dry out and then wet and then dry again, so they go through this sort of natural cycle, are actually usually have the most abundance and diversity of frogs. So rather than a lake that's there permanently, which might support a couple of species of frogs around the edges, so these wetting and drying wetlands are really important. As the wetland dries out, there'll be a whole lot of carbon and nutrients that'll kind of just come to sit on the wetland floor, and then the next time it's inundated, there's this huge boom of resources, like lots of algae will grow, lots of little invertebrates, freshwater invertebrates will come hatch out of eggs and things, and so there'll be this huge boom of food, and then slowly as the wetland dries out, go into like a bust cycle, and everything will sort of go back into dormancy. But that sort of boom bust cycle, that's often where you get the highest concentrations of frogs. Okay, so this is a little bit wordy, but basically if you want to manage... Who's got some land here? Any farmers in the audience here, or people who've got a fair bit of land? So obviously the more land you've got, the more habitat you'll have for frogs. And so basically it's like managing land for any other sort of wildlife. If you retain or revegetate with native vegetation, that's going to enhance the habitat for frogs, but particularly around, obviously for frogs, around wetlands and watercourses. So you've got to maintain the natural hydrology. So, for example, obviously draining wetlands is bad for frogs, but equally as bad can be actually blocking up the outlet or building up the sill of a wetland and making it more permanent. And this has happened in lots of places around Victoria where people have built pondages or impoundments for water storage, and the red gums drown, kills the trees, and creates a permanent water body, which is okay for some species, but it doesn't allow that wetting and drying. And as I said before, the wetting and drying is really critical. It sort of triggers different ecological processes. So obviously you want to minimise nutrient and chemical runoff into wetlands. Excess nutrients can create algal blooms and things like that, but obviously chemicals like fertilisers and herbicides and pesticides can all have negative impacts on frogs, because as I said, they've got sensitive skin that can absorb things across quite easily. And there's more and more studies being done to show even like Roundup can have pretty negative effects on frogs. So you've got to be really careful around allowing runoff into the wetland. Having a vegetated buffer, so having basically an area fenced off around a wetland can really help. Like the more sort of tussock grasses and native shrubs around a wetland you have, then the less likely the nutrients and the herbicides are actually going to flow through, because it acts like a filter strip, like a buffer strip, and to take out some of those sort of nasty chemicals. So having a vegetated buffer around a wetland can be really important. So, and that can be a good thing to do if you've got a wetland, is to actually replant, do some planting around the fringe of it and fence out the fringe. So maintaining micro habitat diversity. So avoiding cropping around wetlands is important, and removing rocks and logs and things like that. Also, you're taking away important habitat. Controlling pest plants and animals. Obviously, pest plants will alter the state of the environment. So things like water weeds, like water hyacinth, will alter the habitat in a wetland. So obviously, you want to avoid weeds from taking over frog habitat. And also pest animals, things like what we were talking about before, redfin, gambusia, or the little plague minnows, the really nasty little predators of tadpoles, and there's possibly one of the reasons something like growling grass frogs have declined. There's a whole lot of threats, which we'll go more later, but basically habitat destruction and introduced animals are really key threats. And managing grazing is really important as well. So it's not to say you can't ever graze in wetlands, and some wetlands, probably when they're in the drying phase, it can be grazed. And so it doesn't mean that wetland has to be taken totally out of a productive cycle, but it's how it's done is really important. So obviously having a fence around a wetland means you can manage the grazing, whether it's in or it's out, and you can then determine when it's going to be grazed. So go to the next picture. So here's just a shot that shows you the impact of grazing. This is so the edge of the wetland's up here, and this fence is just delineating this part of the wetland hasn't been grazed, this part's been really heavily grazed. And so the grazing's basically just removed all of the vegetation cover. So there's no cover here for the frogs, but also no cover for the invertebrates and other things which make up the frog food. So that just gives you a really clear indication of how grazing can impact the frog habitat. And we'll go to the next bit. So that's on the Malort Plains, yep, just not far from west of here. Cropping, so a lot of wetlands, because they're often on fertile soil, and in a dry year, sometimes people think they might get a crop in, and so there's some shots of this bell swamp where there's a crop being put quite close to the edge of the swamp there. This is again out on the Malort Plains, and you can see that that part of the wetland's actually been cropped in the past, probably in a dry year, but in a wet year, obviously the crop doesn't grow very well because it's been inundated. But you can see that that's really removed all that microhabitat from around the edge of the wetland, so all the tussock grasses and things have all been removed, and it's sort of flattened out the landscape and made it not as diverse for the frogs. And also, sorry, can you just go back up? There's no buffer of vegetation there, so any chemicals that are applied to the crop, any herbicides or pesticides, are just going to wash straight into the wetland there. So again, that's not so good for managing the frog population. And so one thing I suppose, we have this thing about tidying up. We like things to be neat and tidy. So, but if you remove things like rocks and logs and tussock grasses, that's all the microhabitat where the frogs they don't just need the water to be able to breed in, they also need their non-breeding habitat. So when the wetlands dry out, they need to move out into the other vegetation and the rocks and logs and things. And as I was saying before, yeah, so things like redfin trout or gambusia, any of those sort of introduced fish aren't really compatible with frogs. So yeah, don't put them in frog habitats. So these next few pictures are just some shots of different wetlands with different management regimes, different grazing regimes and things. So this one here, this is on the Northern Plains. This is a grazed red gum swamp. And this is still, it's still pretty beautiful spot, and it's still got pretty good frog habitat values. It's still got some, the waters there. It's got pretty diverse vegetation. Having grazing though, it's probably there's probably some excess nutrient problems there, and the plant diversity isn't as good as if the grazing was managed differently. So there's an unfenced wetland. The cattle just go in and out when they please. There's a lot of pugging happens as the wetland dries out. The cattle are sort of pugging through the soil, mushing it all up, and so yeah, the plant diversity is probably not as high as it could be. It's just simply fencing off that wetland and excluding the cattle during the spring and early summer when everything's flowering and reproducing would make a huge difference to the diversity. And then once the wetlands dried out, if the grazing would then obviously there'd be a good fodder for the cattle for summer, which is often when the rest of the paddock's dried out, and that doesn't have as devastating effect on the vegetation because everything's flowered and set seed, and so that's an example of where just a fence and a bit of management could make a huge difference to the biodiversity. That's a similar spot on the Northern Plains where you've got a grassy wetland, so it's still quite diverse, quite good habitat, but again, it's grey, so it's it doesn't have the diversity. A bit closer to home on the Malort Plain, there's a red gum swamp with some nice lignin-y kind of understory there, and again, because that's quite heavily grazed by sheep when it's dry. There's not really much understory in there, so the habitat diversity for the frogs is not as good as it could be. And there's a lignum swamp out on the Malort Plains. Again, still quite a lot of cover of wetland plants, but again, because it's grazed by sheep, the plant diversity is lower, and therefore the habitat diversity is not as good for the frogs. Yeah, because basically sheep and cattle and all grazing animals have preferences for what they like, so they go for the most palatable species. So things like the soft herbs are often more nutritious and easier to eat. So so the cattle or sheep will selectively eat those species and leave the kind of tougher things like sedges. So the sedges will end up dominating, and you have less diversity of the other kind of floating and other kind of herbaceous species. So we're going into some differently managed habitats. This is on public land. This is the Doctor's Swamp near Murchison, which is, if you want to go and see a red gum swamp, probably how it should be, you know, or what they would have looked like a couple of hundred years ago. This has got just incredible diversity in the understory, lots of different species of emergent and floating and yeah, really amazing habitat and really, you know, ideal habitat for frogs. Next one. This is an ungrazed creek line on public land in the Heathcote Greytown National Park. This is Spring Creek. And you can see again there's all these habitat components I was talking about. Because it's ungrazed, it's still got all the tussocks around the edge of the wetland. It's got a really fantastic cover of aquatic plants. And there's all that micro-habitat, rocks and logs and things like that. So again, yeah, really specky habitat for frogs. And this is Reedy Lagoon up at Gumbow Forest, again, an ungrazed area and with really high cover of aquatic vegetation. With little parents tree frogs. You can see just one little piece of bark can be a home for these little guys. And they're all just sitting in there sheltering during the day. A little bit of bark that's just hanging up in the giant rush there. But all those last three wetlands, another critical thing about them is because they're on public land, they all have a nice buffer of terrestrial vegetation around the edge. And who can remember what's important about having that buffer of terrestrial plants? Yep.
To stop pesticides and herbicides coming into the...
Exactly. That's the filter strip. So that'll absorb a lot of that nasty stuff like the pollution from running into the wetlands. So you can see. So if you just pop up the last couple of slides, you can see there's a really wide buffer. And the next one, there's native terrestrial plants on the edge of the wetland. Where if we go to the private land examples, there's no real buffer around the wetlands to absorb those nutrients. Okay, this isn't a local frog because I put it in because it looks like it's smiling. Because it's basically so the next part of the talk is about creating habitat for frogs in if you've got a little dam or a pond or even a constructed wetland. A lot of wetlands are constructed now for water treatment, so for treating grey water and things like that. So you can create frog habitat, and this little part of talks about how best to do that. Okay, so you've got to think like a frog if you want to create frog habitat. So so you've got to think about what do frogs like, and they like shallow edge gradients. They don't like big steep holes in the ground. They like nice gentle gradients where you can get a lot of vegetation growing. And this picture here is actually a shot of a constructed wetland. This is a wetland that was built to treat stormwater runoff. And it's been designed to have maximum plant growth because the way you treat water, particularly stormwater, is by having the plants actually do part of the treatment, but it's actually what's called biofilm or algae and funguses and bacteria growing on the stems of the plants. They actually do a lot of the work of cleaning the water, of purifying the water, and particularly there's bacteria called denitrifying bacteria, which can take sort of biologically available nitrogen and turn it into nitrogen gas. And so they basically they're like a kidney of an ecosystem. They sort of strip out all excess pollution and nutrients. So having lots of plants and having lots of these algae and bacteria are really beneficial for cleaning the water. And so having these shallow edges means that you've got lots of area for the plants to grow, but it also means you've got lots of spots for frogs to live. And having just little pools as well. There's lots of little micro-habitats. So there might be some deeper water out here, some shallow water here, which only sits there for a couple of months. And so, and the other thing about drying out a wetland, obviously, is that it wipes out the fish. So it wipes out the predator, the predators, things like gambusia or redfin. Obviously, they can't survive in a dry wetland. So having little bits that dry out can be beneficial. You want to provide a diverse range of plants. So from those categories I talked about before, so things like your emergent sedges, your tussocks, down to some floating lily pad type things like some water, some marsh flowers, water ribbons, things like that. And some, if you've got some deeper water, so some submerged plants like your eelgrass and pondweeds and things like that. Having rocks and logs and leaf litter around the edge is also obviously important for microhabitat. As we've talked about, they want clean water, they don't want dirty, polluted water. So So runoff off your roof or stormwater is generally about as dirty as they want. That you don't want black water or more polluted water. Obviously, is not going to be good for frogs. And having a wetting and drying cycle. So your little pond or whatever. I mean, a lot of people think, if it's an ornamental pond, it should be full of water all the time. But again, if you can let it dry out a bit, it actually mimics the natural cycle and will be more beneficial for native plants and animals. Okay, so if you wanted to, say you've decided that you want to revegetate your dam or construct a little wetland for frogs, a good thing to do is actually find a reference site. So try and find a good wetland and a sort of ecologically intact wetland with lots of plants somewhere nearby, which has got similar characteristics. So it might have the same sort of soil type of the area that you want to revegetate, similar kind of soil chemistry like salinity and things like that, and similar depth to what you're trying to create, and that'll be your reference site. That'll be something you can always go back to and say, okay, well, these are the sorts of plants that I should be planting. This is the sort of depth of water I should be planting this species in because that's where it's growing in my reference site. So if you can find, a lot of wetlands are obviously unfortunately degraded, but generally in any given area there's often a few little magic spots you can go and find a good reference site. Okay, so if you're planning a frog creation project, you want to put a bit of thought into designing it. So don't just sort of go off with your shovel and start digging, or your D9 and start digging out holes. You want to put a bit of thought into the design process. So draw a bit of a plan, decide what sort of species you want to plant for the plant species for habitat. Think about what other habitat you could provide if you've got some logs and things lying around. Obviously don't go into the bush and raid hollow logs and rip rocks and things out of the bush, because obviously you're stealing it from native wildlife that are already probably using it. But if you've got trees that have fallen over, or there's rocks available, you might use them as habitat. So then you want to think about where am I going to get the plants from? There's a few fantastic native plant nurseries around, like Newstead Natives, or there's up in Bendigo, there's Goldfields Revegetation, which sell wetland plants and tussocks and things to plant around the edge. Or you might want to actually try and grow some yourself, which is always good fun, but you'll have to go and collect seed and cuttings, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. You need to prepare the area for planting, so make sure it's ready to go. Control the weeds first, and if you've got a dam that's been dug into the subsoil and you try planting plants, it can be really hard to establish plants, so you might actually need to put some soil in there. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. You'll need to do your put your plants in. Sometimes you need to actually guard them from water birds, things like swans and purple swamp hens. They're adapted to eating water plants, and if you can just give them a free lunch and they might just come and eat everything you plant, and so you need to actually guard the plant sometimes to get them established. Obviously you want to control weeds, so your native plants get a good chance to grow and fill up the space. And then you can just sit back and relax and enjoy watching your wetland, your little habitat develop, and see what moves in. And ideally, you don't go taking frogs from one area and putting them in your pond. The best way to do it is just to let them naturally colonise. And they will. Like, frogs move around an amazing amount. Like, a growling grass frog can move 1 kilometre, apparently, in one night, so which is probably equivalent to us to running about 60 kilometres. So yeah, they will move around, and if they move in of their own accord and they settle in and they're happy, then they've moved in and they know that the habitat's right and there's enough food. Whereas if you go just moving them from one place to another, you might be dumping them into a place where the food hasn't built up enough yet, or they're just not happy there because it's not quite deep enough, or not doesn't have quite the right characteristics. So the best measure of success is if you build it and they come in. Then you can feel happy that you've done the right job. Okay, so if you want to collect some seed of wetland plants, collect it from as close to the area as possible. So you're using local provenance plants, so they're adapted to the local environment. Who knows why it's important to use local plants? Any reasons people can think of? So you're maintaining genetic diversity, so you're not sort of bringing in genes from other gene pools, and you're maintaining the local gene pool. Any other reason why you might use local plants? you probably have more success because they're adapted to the local environmental conditions. Yeah, so there's lots of reasons you try and use local stuff. With wetland plants, so the idea of provenance is interesting because some wetland species are evolved to disperse with water birds and things like that. So it's probably a little bit less restricted than, say, if you're growing a plant that is pollinated by birds and the seeds only wind dispersed. You wouldn't want to go more than, say, 10 kilometres, or probably even less, because you're going to be mucking with gene pools. Whereas with some of the wetland plants, they have little hooks on the seeds which might get stuck in a duck's feather, and then the duck might migrate 100 or 1,000 kilometres before the feather drops out and the seed comes out. So some of those species, some wetland plants, they're genetically similar from here to Darwin. So the provenance thing isn't quite as important, but still, it's always best. I would always say it's best to go with as local as you can. And if you want to collect seed, do it summer and autumn, but it's sort of the peak time to get out and collect the seed. And you want to have a bit of experience. You want to make sure you're collecting off lots of adult plants, and collect the seed when it's ripe, so don't get it when it's too green, and don't contaminate it with weeds as you're collecting it. So there's different types of formats you can grow plants in if you want to revegetate wetlands. These little hyco cells are a kind of efficient way of doing it. They're a bit smaller than a forestry tube, usually a bit cheaper to produce, but they're a decent enough size that you'll grow a decent sized plant. You don't want to plant wetland plants too small, so those little tiny enviro cells that sometimes you can get, there's not much volume there for the plants to develop a good root system, and often if you do have, say, some birds move in, if you plant those little enviro cells, the birds they'll just rip them out and eat them, no worries. Or if say you plant the wetland and then all of a sudden there's a big lot of rain and the water comes up really quickly, those little tiny plants aren't going to have much chance of survival. But something like tube stock or these hycos are a bit more robust. For something that's a spreading kind of species, like things like this is native buttercup or some of the other sedges, it's best to actually grow them in a big wide container because that's how they want to grow. They want to spread their roots out and reproduce that way, sort of vegetative out sideways. And you can just chop them up and plant them out of a tray. So depending on what plant, you can use different containers. Okay, so this is a little project to retrofit. This is a dam on our place, and you can see that it was just dug out into the subsoil. There's a little bit of topsoil there, but basically the whole rest of the dam, there was just nothing to plant anything into. And so I wanted to plant some frog habitat in there. So I've built these little planting benches. And if we go to the next picture, it's just a little sequence of how it's been done. So not too far from the top water level, because obviously you don't want to drown the plants when the water does come up. But it's best to do this. Luckily, I got it in just in time before we had all the rain, so it was at the end of the drought. The dam level was really low. I could get in there and just scrape out a bit of a flat spot and use a bit of wood to make a little bench. Then I used a bit of jute matting here just to sort of stabilise everything and hold the soil in. I've got some nice, rich, organic topsoil. That's actually really black. You can see there's lots of organic content. You probably want at least 5% organic matter in it, just that gives it something for plants, for something to grow in. Whereas you can see the subsoil around the edge, there's probably zero organic content, and if I planted into that, the plants just wouldn't really grow. So, yep, go to the next one. Oh, actually, sorry, that previous one. You can see some of the planting benches were just at about 80 centimetres below the top water level, and this planting bench here, I actually made it go right up to the top of where the normal top water level is, so I can have plants growing all the way down from the top of the water down into the deeper water. So if you're going to plant a dam or a pond or a wetland, make sure you have enough plants to get a really thick growth of plants quite quickly, because often the edge of a wetland is a great place for weeds to grow as well. There's things like Yorkshire fog and a whole lot of other weeds which like that kind of damp, sort of moist, often fairly fertile environment. And so if you just plant the odd plant here and there, like maybe one and then have a gap of a metre and then another plant, you're going to have lots of space for weeds to grow. But if you can afford it, particularly if you grow the plants yourself, If you grow, a couple of hundred plants and you can plant them quite densely, then they'll grow really quickly and they'll take up all the space, and there won't be any room for the weeds to grow. So I generally recommend in the actual water itself, if you plant 2 or 4 plants per square metre, it's usually enough. But on the edge, if you plant sort of 5 or 6 per square metre, it can be quite expensive, obviously, if you've got a big area, but it just means you're not going to have to muck around. You're probably better off spending your money on plants than having to, go out and weed it for 12 hours a day. And you want to plant the plants in the right zone around a wetland. And obviously, wetland plants grow in fairly distinct zones around wetlands. You can see there's a really distinct band. And it's just got to do with where the water level sits when the water's full and then as the wetland dries out. So you can see there's a band of juncus here, and then down into the deeper water, there's eelgrass and things. And so you want to make sure you plant the plants in the right spot. And often for deeper water species, just plant them at the shallower edge of their range of where they like it, and then they'll sort of grow out into the deeper water. Whereas if you try and plant some plants out in the deep water, they won't survive. As I said, a lot of things like swans really love things like border ribbons or other herbaceous type aquatic plants. And so if you don't give them some protection, you'll have basically just fed the swans. So if you put a bit of netting over the top, so this is just wire hoops here with some grape bird netting over the top, and leave it there for a couple of months till the plants get established, and then then you can pull it off, and the swans can go for their life, and but the plants will be well enough established to survive a bit of grazing pressure. And also, the old stitch in time saves 9 adage, for things like weeds, if you can get them as they invade and pull them out, you'll save yourself heaps of time further down the track by trying to control an established infestation. So here, there's this wetland here's got this Canadian pondweed in it, and you can see it's just, if you got onto it early on, so if you'd sort of monitored it and said, okay, I can see there's a bit of that pondweed there, and I can pull it out while it's only a small infestation. If you leave it too long, there's just going to be so much of it there that trying to control that now is almost impossible. So this is just a bit of a sequence of shots to show how quickly wetland vegetation can develop. This is at a project we did down in Mordialloc, and it was at the time was the largest constructed wetland in the southern hemisphere. I think we planted about 1.5 million plants over about 30 hectares. So the first one, sorry, if we just go back. So first one, you can see all the weeds have been controlled, and we've marked out where the different water depths are going to be with these stakes, and so we're ready to go. And then the next slide, that's about 3 months later. So we've got the initial plants here. They were netted, and the guards have been taken off, the ones that were in the deeper water, and we're working our way out to the shallower bit there. And then next picture, 12 months later, we've got a really nice thick cover of aquatic plants. There's already frogs and birds moving in, starting to breed, and you can sort of see that going from the start to now, there's basically very little room for weeds to invade because we've got the plants established nice and quickly. This next couple of pictures are just some examples of created frog habitats. So this is a little frog habitat pond. It was planted as part of a bigger project. Next picture. So this is just an idea of the diversity of plants you can get established. You've got things like running marsh flowers here. There's a little native buttercup, the water ribbons. These are woolly water lilies, which are an endangered wetland plant, and some. Yeah. Anyway, so you've got the more diversity, the more habitat, the more micro niches, the better frog habitat it'll be. Similar sort of thing. Next one. Oh yeah, so these just give you an example of the salinity of the water, and the type of soil that. So obviously, it's just giving you an idea that you're trying to match the vegetation to the environment of the plants that you're planting. This is some grassland around the edge of a wetland. So obviously, remembering that frogs need terrestrial habitats as well as the wetlands. They need somewhere to overwinter, so they need tussock grasses and sedges and things. This is some grassland planted next to a wetland. And this is some sort of swamp scrub and shrubby vegetation. There's another little wetland in a golf course. Again, nice thick, dense water ribbons for frog. That's fantastic frog habitat and good cover of plants on the edge of the wetland as well. So how do you say your establishment or your frog creation habitat project was successful? Well, there's a couple of ways you could measure how successful you've been. You could look at the water quality in your wetland and monitor that. Obviously, doing Waterwatch is a good way to, you can monitor the phosphorus or the turbidity and all those sorts of things. You could do a survey of the structure of your wetland, so the species diversity of the plants and that sort of thing. Are other plants recruiting themselves? Are they sort of spreading and coming up from seed? But the main thing, I suppose, are frogs moving in? And you know that if the frogs move in, then you've done a good job. So at this project at the Waterways, as I said, we planted 40 hectares of re-veg. We restored 9 different EVCs or 9 different vegetation types in different habitats across the site. We planted over 230 different species of plants, and there was 15 of those were rare and threatened plants. So we were trying to establish good diversity of plants as well as habitat for birds and animals. We had 112 birds moved in. This was in about the first 5 or 6 years after the wetland was established. We had lots of birds breeding. We had magpie geese come back into this area, which they hadn't been seen in this area for about 100 years, and they moved back into the habitat that was created there. More recently, we've actually had brolgers come back into that area as well. That hadn't been seen in that. This is all southeast of Melbourne, and those species hadn't been seen around there for about 100 years. Probably had a lot to do with the climate. We had a lot more rain and everything. It obviously brought a lot of the wetlands back to life, and birds moved around a lot more. And we've got 7 species of frogs recorded at that wetland since we planted it as well. So so that lots of big breeding choruses of frogs. So it gives you an idea that that's been a reasonably successful habitat creation project. So that's about it.